Eagles Entertainment.
With the 10th pick in the 2021 NFL Draft, the Philadelphia Eagles select.
You're listening to the Journey to the Draft podcast.
Welcome to the Journey to the Draft podcast, presented by Life Brand. I'm your host, Fran Duffy, and we're continuing our recap here of the 2021 NFL Draft, now looking at a couple of divisions today in the NFC and AFC North. And we will start that off with Draft Buzz, where I catch up with Dane, Brugler, and Ben Fennell to discuss the Minnesota Vikings, Chicago Bears, and the Green Bay Packers over in the NFC, before we then transition to the AFC and we discuss the Cincinnati Bengals, the Cleveland Browns, the Pittsburgh Steelers, and the Baltimore Ravens. And remember, the main goal of these conversations, we're not giving out draft grades and A, B, C, D. We're going to discuss not just like who won and lost the draft. That's not the goal of this. It's more about discussing team building philosophy, the whys behind certain selections, and really just kind of put this class to bed. And we're going to continue that conversation here with that last NFC North team. Remember, I mentioned Green Bay, Minnesota, Chicago. Well, we're going to cover the Detroit Lions in the Blueprint segment where I catch up with Chris Burke, who covers the Lions for The Athletic, and he's going to join us to discuss the maiden voyage for the Lions in this draft under new general manager Brad Holmes, who was hired away from the LA Rams this offseason. What trends did we see pop up in this class? What can we learn about their process moving into next year? We will talk about all of that with Chris, and we'll wrap it up with Draft Mailbag. We got a great question from you at home that'll play more to our Eagles fans here that are listening to this show. And remember, for Eagles fans, we'll be back later this week on Thursday. My plan is that our first episode of our Journey series will drop. It's going to be all of our analysis pre-draft of Devontae Smith, the Eagles' first-round pick. So for our Eagles listeners, Eagles fans listeners, make sure you tune in later this week right here on the Journey to the Draft podcast. For today, we're going to dive into the AFC and NFC North. For those that are subscribing to this show, maybe you've never listened before. This is not an Eagles-only podcast. I promise. We cover every single team all year round. We discuss prospects, team fits, team-building philosophies like we are today, and we do that throughout the calendar year. So be sure to subscribe. Take that ride with us all the way up to the 2022 NFL Draft. We will start breaking down those prospects here in the next couple of weeks. That being said, let's get this show rolling. It's now to kick things off with Draft Buzz.
Now it's time for Draft Buzz.
All right, let's get rolling here with Draft Buzz, and rather than exchange pleasantries, let's cut through it, guys. Let's get right into it here as we talk through the NFC North, and we're going to start with the Minnesota Vikings. I'll run through their picks really quickly before we get going here with Dane Brugler and Ben Fennell. Day one, the Vikings trade down. They take offensive tackle Christian Darrisaw from Virginia Tech. Day two, a few picks here. Quarterback Kellen Mond, Texas A&M. Linebacker Chaz Surratt from North Carolina, Ohio State guard Wyatt Davis, and then Pitt pass rusher Patrick Jones, and then a handful here on day three. Dane, your boy from Iowa State, running back Kenny Nwangu, Cam Bynum, the safety from Cal, Janarius Robinson, the pass rusher from Florida State, wide receiver Amir Smith-Marset from Iowa, Zach Davidson, the talented tight end from Central Missouri, and then Pitt defensive tackle Jalen Twyman. Ton of picks here for the Vikings, which is pretty typical for them. And we'll get into this top pick here, Dane. Let's talk about Christian Darrisaw. In your mind, why was he the pick here for the Minnesota Vikings after the trade down from 14 to 23?
Yeah, it was an interesting trade because I know they had a high grade on Elijah Vera Tucker. I know that for a fact. And so I think it's interesting they traded away from him. It would have been really interesting if Justin Fields was still on the board. What did they do there? Mac Jones was on the board. They passed on him. And they also had their chance to draft any of these defensive ends, and they passed on that as well, which, we know is something they've done in the past. But so trading back's usually the right move, but it's always interesting who you trade away from. But in this scenario, I think they were still able to get a really good player at 23 in Christian Darrisaw, who I think if he was the pick at 14, I don't think it would have been that big of a shock. You could understand it. You can explain why that would make sense in their thinking with wanting to get better on the offensive line. He's a wide base player, good feet, terrific balance, the play strength. He can match defenders in pass pro. He can create movement in the run game. You wish he was just a little bit better of a finisher. Kept his foot on the pedal through the whistle. But I remember back in, I think it was October on this podcast saying, I had a sneaky OT2 possibility and he ended up being OT3. So Darrisaw is a good player. And I think that because they were comfortable with Ezra Cleveland playing either guard or tackle, that helped them with the risk of trading back, because if Darrisaw is still there, okay, they could take him. Presumably he's going to be the left tackle, and Cleveland just stays inside at guard. So I think that Ezra Cleveland, that flexibility that he offers gave them a little bit of flexibility with who they were going to draft in the first round.
And the Minnesota Vikings, a team, when you look at Rick Spielman, his history, they love trading down, whether it's round one, day two, day three. They like to acquire as many picks as possible. As you could tell from the laundry list of names I named at the top of the segment, they love to move down in the draft, as many cracks at the apple as possible. A ton of players in this class, and that is very typical of them and their approach. Ben, let's come to you here. Our surprise impact. Who's a player that could shock us with the impact they have in year one when you look at this class overall?
Well, there's a couple interesting players there on day three. Really intrigued to see the Iowa State kid go that early ahead of guys like Kenneth Gainwell and Chuba Hubbard. But I'm really interested to see Amir Smith-Marset out of Iowa, who's a 5th-round pick. I think he has a chance to be the kind of darling on day three of this group. I think his QB issues at Iowa really allude to why he had that bad production. Also had some off the field stuff that forced him to slide in the draft. Ahead of him on the depth chart, I'm looking at BC Johnson and Chad Beebe for that third receiver spot. So whether you want to be the gadget guy, taking jet sweeps, end arounds, or maybe you're just the shot play guy off play action that we know they like to use a lot up in Minnesota, reminds me a lot of Ted Ginn or a Brandon Tate style of player that I think is a perfect receiver 3 or receiver 4 for that offense.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at that receiver depth chart, he's got a nice, clean path to potentially being the number 3 receiver in that offense here as a rookie. I think BC Johnson is a player that I think all three of us liked when he came out of Colorado State a couple of years ago. But I'm interested to see ultimately who takes that number 3 receiver job in that offense. Dane, kind of same idea here. Let's go day 3. Look at all those day 3 picks. Who's got the highest ceiling of their third day selections when you look at the class overall?
Yeah, I think maybe there's a better chance of Cam Bynum or maybe even Jalen Twyman securing maybe more consistent playing time. But if we're talking about ceiling, I agree with Ben. I think it's Smith-Marset. I mean, he gets my vote because of the speed. 20 touchdowns over his career at Iowa, and he did it in 3 different ways. I'm sure, like Ben was talking about, we're going to see Minnesota use him in a similar way. Jet sweeps, tunnel screens, vertical shots, use him as a return man. I thought he was a little muted in that Iowa offense. He needs to be a better finisher at the catch point. There's no question about that. But in terms of ceiling, his athleticism, I think gives him it's an intriguing fit with the possibility that he could fit in at that number 3 spot for that Vikings offense. So just talking about ceiling, Smith-Marset gets my vote.
And to me, like Zach Davidson, the tight end, really interesting high ceiling player. This guy's a great athlete with great size at the position, was a specialist. I mean, he was a punter throughout the majority of his high school and college career, really only kind of moonlighted as a tight end and was stupid productive in 2019. I mean, I think he averaged over 23, 24 yards a catch, was one of the most productive players at the D2 level. Obviously did not play this season, but that is certainly a player just to keep an eye on. He is a long ways away from being able to contribute as a full-time player, but just a really interesting roll of the dice there for the Minnesota Vikings. And when you have that many selections, that's something you can do. And I guess that can kind of take us into our over the top here, guys. Just big takeaways from this draft and what it says about their team building philosophy and the franchise moving forward. And to me, it is just looking at day 3. It's always fun because, we had Arif Hassan on earlier this offseason talking about the Vikings and just their overall draft strategy. And he talked about, hey, look, early day 3, they love to add highly athletic special teams stalwarts, right? And that's where the Iowa State running back comes in. Check. Big, long, rangy defensive end. Last year they took DJ Wanham from South Carolina. Hey, we're gonna plug in Janarius Robinson, cut from the same cloth, very similar kind of player. Yep, check. Upside pass catcher with traits. All right, there's the tight end, Zach Davidson, right? Highly productive player that didn't test well as expected. Okay, check. Jalen Twyman. They love getting these kind of profile guys. And when you trade down and you're picking 8, 9, 10, 11 guys each and every year, you can check a lot of these boxes and maybe half of them work or maybe half of them don't. But you start hitting on some of these day 3 selections. I think that's a big time strategy for the Vikings when you look at Rick Spielman's history. Dane, any other kind of big picture looks at this Vikings draft strategy?
Well, it's also interesting that they had that many picks, but they only had one pick in the first 65.
Right.
So they really trust their scouting staff that, hey, we're going to have 4 third round picks and all these fourth and fifths, and we feel good we're going to hit on those guys. Are going to be able to round out this roster. Trading back with the Jets instead of making sure that pick 34 to the Jets was part of that trade. They were okay with the 2 third rounders. So just interesting strategy there. But I'm also really interested in how they view the state of their quarterback situation. Yeah. We talked a lot about this with the Falcons and Matt Ryan, how, obviously the Falcons had a much higher pick, but it's a kind of a similar situation. Cousins is due a lot of money the next 2 seasons. And the idea of securing the long term of the position had to be appealing. They had a chance at Mac Jones, but they didn't see the value there. Instead, they used one of the picks that they get from the Jets, trading back to get Kellen Mond, who, in my opinion, has a much lower chance of starting in the league. But I don't blame the Vikings for making that trade, because instead of drafting, say, a Mac Jones at 14, they turned that pick into Darisaw, Mond, and Wyatt Davis. So, we'll see on Mond, but Darisaw and Davis, potentially 2 long-term pieces of the offensive line. So just interesting to see Minnesota, how they view their quarterback position. They're still betting on Cousins while also throwing a dart on Kellen Mond.
Ben, any thoughts when you look at this Vikings team overall and how they've approached this class?
It's really quick. I think this was what I call an oil change draft. This wasn't the paint job. This wasn't getting the kit. This was fixing the trenches, the O-line, the D-line. They really needed tone setters. They needed an attitude change on that offensive line. Last year's draft, you got the first round receiver. You got the first round corner. We paid the running back. We went and got Patrick Peterson in free agency. Took care of a lot of the stuff on the outside. But you had to go under the hood. You had to change the oil. You had to give this offense and defensive line a tune-up. And I see a lot of really interesting players that come in and make impacts early. Darisaw, Wyatt Davis, Janoris Robinson, I could see being a nice rotational player. Jalen Twyman, Patrick Jones. This was a trench-based draft.
All right, let's get to team number 2 here, the Chicago Bears, who make one of the big moves of the first round. They trade up and get Ohio State quarterback Justin Fields. They trade up again on day 2. They take the offensive tackle Tevin Jenkins from Oklahoma State, and then a handful of day 3 selections here. Missouri offensive tackle Larry Borum, Virginia Tech running back Khalil Herbert, North Carolina slot receiver Daz Newsome, Oregon corner Thomas Graham, and then BYU defensive tackle Kairos Tonga. Dane, let's talk through Justin Fields. He kind of falls right into their lap, right? He moves down, falls out of the top 10. The Bears make that trade up with the New York Giants, and they get their guy to build on moving forward here with Ryan Pace and Matt Nagy.
Yeah, Fields represents hope for a franchise stuck in mediocrity, plain and simple. Rarely do we see general managers and head coaches, they get to select multiple first-round quarterbacks. Sometimes maybe the GM will, or maybe the head coach will, but it's rarely both, general manager and head coach. But Ryan Pace, Matt Nagy, they're afforded the opportunity. They might have the chance to alter the narrative of their tenure in Chicago after that Trubisky pick backfired. And with Fields, he has the type of traits worth betting on. He's a tad too methodical with his process, and that's what bothered me the most. It's why he was my 4th-ranked quarterback. But all the talent in the world is there for Fields to be a starting NFL quarterback. Mobility, toughness, accuracy within structure. I do think Andy Dalton will be the starter for Chicago, but we're going to see Fields at some point this season. No question about that.
Ben, when you look at this class as a whole, who do you see as kind of the best fit? When you look at the situation they're walking into, just has that best path for early success in the NFL?
We got to look at their 2nd-round pick, Tevin Jenkins, who I think they feel they got a great value seeing him slide to the 2nd round. He's going to be their starting left tackle day 1. Filling that Charles Leno role out there, working next to James Daniel at left guard. This is a team that wants to run the ball. And you can even look a little bit further. Larry Borum out of Missouri, 5th-round pick, he might be able to win the right tackle job. He's looking at Elijah Wilkinson as the incumbent starter. There's a lot of kind of Midwest players out in that Chicago Bears team. They got to run the ball, protect their young quarterback early in his career. I think Tevin Jenkins could be, one of those kind of rookies that take our breath away early in the season, a lot like the way Jedrick Wills played for the Cleveland Browns last year.
So they take Jenkins in round 2. Let's get to day 3, Dane. Which of these guys on the 3rd day of the draft do you feel has the ability to make the biggest impact long term?
The Bears cornerback depth chart is full of former Pac-12 guys. Desmond Trufant, Jalen Johnson, now Thomas Graham, who was a steal in the 6th round, I thought. Over his career at Oregon, he had 40 passes defended and 39 starts. Not a top-tier athlete by NFL standards, but he plays controlled, plays smooth, really competitive player. The coaches say he's a really coachable kid. And I think that's going to help him get on the field early and make an impact, maybe as early as a rookie year.
To me, I really like the Khalil Herbert selection as well. I think obviously, look, you have David Montgomery, you've got Tariq Cohen there. The early stages of that depth chart are kind of set at running back, but still always looking for those kind of role players. And I feel like Herbert has that ability to be a nice change of pace option as a backup. But then if Montgomery goes down, Tariq Cohen isn't going to be a full-time back. That's just not his skill set, right? I think Herbert has that ability to carry that load over short spurts. And now you've got that guy to be that true backup to David Montgomery. I really like that selection there for the Chicago Bears. He kind of reminded me of a former Bear in Mike Davis, who's not going to be the full-time back for the Atlanta Falcons, it looks like, this season. Guys, when we look over the top here, any big takeaways to this approach? To me, I look at the move up for Justin Fields. I think a lot of people will say, oh, well, this buys the regime time and buys Ryan Pace and Matt Nagy time. I think when you look at the round one quarterbacks over the years, that's not always the case. That does not always buy patience from ownership, especially over the last 5, 6, 7 years. I don't think that's a guarantee. That said, I think if you get that pick right, that completely changes the outlook on this entire, the coaching staff and the personnel staff. You look at, to me, like even thinking of like a Jason Light down in Tampa. He was the butt of jokes. They trade up for a kicker in round 2 and look at this bust and this bad pick and that bad pick. When you get some core selections right, which I think when you look at the Bears and some of the players they've selected over the last 2-3 years, they've picked some good players. And now if you get that quarterback right, which Tampa did in free agency, they obviously they get Tom Brady. That's a little bit different than this scenario. But if you get that quarterback position right, it erases other mistakes. And I do think that, look, if you're able to get Justin Fields and he's able to reach that ceiling, I think that helps everybody in that organization. Ben, I'll come to you next. When you look at this team overall, any overall thoughts just in terms of their approach to this draft?
No, a lot like the Vikings. I think trying to solidify that offensive line, particularly the tackle spot, was imperative after finding that quarterback of the future. Just a fascinating study. How often does a GM get 2 situations to trade up for a first-round quarterback with the same team? It's a very kind of rare circumstance to evaluate and analyze.
How about you, Dane?
Yeah, I mean, kind of echoing what you guys are saying. I think it's an interesting test case, how taking big swings can be exciting, but also the risk is heavy. Assuming that they don't trade up in next year's draft, Fields will be their only top 40 pick in a 4-year period. They lost their 2019 and 2020 first-round picks in the Khalil Mack trade. Next year's first for Fields. Now, obviously, time will tell with Fields and his impact with the Bears if that trade was worth it. But it's just an interesting philosophy and one that I don't necessarily disagree with. Taking big swings on players, whether that's trading for a Khalil Mack or drafting a Justin Fields. If you can find difference makers, then, I get it. But there's obviously a ton of risk involved. And the Bears have not been shy about taking those chances.
And I think this time of year is really important for teams like the Bears, like the Jets, to do some self-scouting and maybe be honest with themselves about why did the Sam Darnold era go so poorly? Why did the Mitch Trubisky era not work out? Are we going to learn from our mistakes, or are we going to go through the same kind of situation? What's different about this situation versus 4 or 5 years ago when we were just as excited about Mitch Trubisky, just as excited about Sam Darnold, but it didn't work out? The question is why.
Yeah, we talked about that last week, right? With the Jets, they trade away Sam Darnold this offseason. So what do? They get Zach Wilson. You trade up for an offensive lineman after taking the left tackle last year. You take a receiver there in round 2. You take a running back in round 3. So trying to build up around that quarterback. We'll see what the Chicago Bears continue to do here for Justin Fields. Let's round out our NFC North conversation here in this discussion, this segment, guys, with the Green Bay Packers. We'll run through their picks really fast. Day 1, they take the Georgia corner Eric Stokes. Day 2, Ohio State center Josh Myers alongside Clemson wide receiver Amari Rodgers. And then on day 3, you've got the Ole Miss offensive lineman Royce Newman, Florida nose tackle TJ Slayton, App State corner Shamar Jean-Charles, offensive tackle Cole Van Lanen from Wisconsin, Boston College linebacker Isaiah McDuffie, and Mississippi State running back Kylan Hill. Ben, let's come to you for Eric Stokes. In your mind, why is Eric Stokes the selection here for the Green Bay Packers?
Well, they're certainly looking to address the long-term need opposite Jair Alexander. They brought back Kevin King on a kind of friendly free agent contract to kind of hold it down if Eric Stokes isn't ready. But Eric Stokes will be that long-term answer opposite a very good corner in Jair. It's a traits-based pick, obviously with his elite 4.2 speed. He's got linear speed. He's got recovery speed. He's got the click and close speed. Very easy transitions and press man coverage, played a variety of schemes, which in Green Bay, they're going to play some press man and play a lot of zone as well. So you got to be able to be comfortable in a variety of schemes. The issue with him is, the ball skills. He's not as feisty and as aggressive as some of those other Georgia corners like Tyson Campbell and DJ Daniel, and just the balance at the top of routes and the ability to anticipate routes and the timing. But he brings some traits and some God-given abilities that you cannot coach. So it's definitely a traits-based pick, and hopefully the long-term projection, they walk into a really nice corner like they did with Jair.
Yeah, I'm going to build off that one point a little bit later here in this segment for sure about the trait-based drafting with the Packers. Dane, coming to you here, looking at this class, which of these players enters a crowded room to kind of compete in where you're like, all right, like it might be a little bit tough for him to make that year one impact? This is not a knock against the player. It's more about the situation. Do you look at one of these guys and say, man, I don't know if we might hear his name as often year two or year one or even year two?
I think you look at the first two picks. I think they have somewhat crowded paths as rookies. Jair Alexander, obviously one outside corner spot lockdown. Stokes is going to compete with Kevin King, Josh Jackson for the other spot. And then Josh Myers on the interior. Obviously, Elgin Jenkins has one of those spots on the interior. John Runyon entering his second year as a pro. The Packers think he's ready to really compete for a full-time job. Lucas Patrick is a returning starter. So Myers, and throw Royce Newman in there, the fourth-round pick. They're going to be part of that offensive line mix in some way, but it might be a little crowded to start off.
Ben, when you look at this group as a whole, which of these picks do you feel like was the best value? And obviously value is a subjective question, right? Because what I see as good value may be different from you or from Dane or from anybody else. But in your mind, who was the highest value selection when you look at the Packers class overall?
Well, I like the versatility and the experience in fourth round pick, Royce Newman, but I got to go to the fifth round. TJ to Daryl Slayton out of Florida, I think has his best football ahead of him. He is a massive, powerful, yet unrefined nose tackle, one tech. I'm looking at the depth chart. He must look to take snaps away from Tyler Lancaster. And what they need him to do, he can do. He could be that run plugger. He could be that two-gapper against centers and guards and plug the A-gaps. He can hold up double teams. He's impossible to move off the spot. And when I look at, Joe Barry's defense coming from the Los Angeles Rams, I had a tremendous amount of respect for guys like Michael Brockers, who played 9 years, over 6,000 snaps. He was the 14th overall pick. Listen, this guy doesn't get double-digit sacks. He barely gets single-digit sacks. Aaron Donald does a lot of that dirty work. Doesn't make a lot of highlights. But this is a really, really good football player that does a lot of dirty work on that defense. I know Brockers is no longer in LA. I think he took a free agent contract somewhere. But I could see TJ Slayton being a similar type of presence for that Packers trench.
Yeah, Brockers moved over to the Detroit Lions. He followed Brad Holmes there with the former general manager. So to me, when I look at Slayton, this was a guy just under a year ago. I caught up with someone who was on that Florida staff. They told me they had very high aspirations for him going into his final season, that he could potentially make that jump and be in that first round mix. That didn't happen for him, but I agree with you. This is a guy who his best football could be ahead of him when you look at his size and ability to impact the game. Me personally, I'm just really excited to see Amari Rodgers there in Green Bay. And really it's because of that versatile skill set. I mean, this past year as a senior, we saw him used more vertically down the field. We know that he's got that running back build. So could he be like that Deebo Samuel kind of weapon there for Matt LaFleur in that offense? I do wonder exactly how they're going to use him, because even going to the Senior Bowl, you see him, he's one of the best route runners down there as well. So he can do a lot of different things for an offense. I can't wait to see how he's used in the structure, in that Packers Matt LaFleur scheme. It's going to be really fun to be able to watch Amari Rodgers there. Looking at this over the top, though, guys, just big picture takeaways with the Packers. To me, I mentioned earlier, kind of alluded to it, and Ben, building off your point on Eric Stokes, this is, and everybody comes from somewhere. All these general managers, they all have their influences. And when you look, at Brian Gutekunst, obviously he comes up in that Green Bay system. Ron Wolf, Ted Thompson, it is traits-based drafting. What are the things that these guys can lean on? Whether it's size, athleticism, something that kind of sets themselves apart from other players. And I think overall, when you look at the talent they bring in, very often they're going to have something that kind of sets them apart, whether it's that athleticism, the speed, or the size. I think that's a pretty consistent thing overall. Dane, what do you see when you look at this class overall?
Well, I kind of wanted to, echo what you were saying about Amari Rodgers. And I thought it was really interesting because it's a little bit against type when you think about the receivers, the type of receivers the Packers have drafted. And, to go along with, your interest in how they're going to use him, same thing, because it's not the type of guy they usually draft at that position. You have to go back almost 10 years. The last time Green Bay drafted a sub 6-foot receiver in the first 3 rounds, that was Randall Cobb. So Rodgers goes against the trends a little bit, but he gives the Packers a really valuable pass catching option who can do a lot of things. And so just thought it was interesting that they went against type and went with a guy who's really talented, but I'm like you, I'm really interested to see how they use him in that offense.
And again, Ron Wolf, who is the mentor there for Ted Thompson and Brian Gutekunst, very strict in terms of those position profiles and what they look for from a prototype standpoint. Ben, what did you see when you look at this class overall?
I see a lot of versatile players, whether it's Amari Rodgers, whether you want to call him a slot or a running back or a slot back. Royce Newman has snaps at left tackle, left guard, right tackle, and played center at the Senior Bowl. There's guys like Isaiah McDuffie, who reminds me a lot of Eric Wilson, who the Philadelphia Eagles just signed coming over from the Vikings, that didn't have a spot coming out of Cincinnati and then ended up playing Mike, Will, Sam, special teams. Isaiah McDuffie is a clone of him. So there's a lot of guys that I think can wear multiple hats. So versatility is always value, and it seems like Green Bay has a type with those types of players.
All right, guys, let's go over to the AFC North here, and we'll talk through the Cincinnati Bengals, the team that had the 5th pick, and they made Jamar Chase out of LSU, the 5th overall pick in this class. You go to day 2, they take Clemson offensive lineman Jackson Carman and Texas pass rusher Joseph Osai. Day 3, you get Tulane defensive lineman Cam Sample, LSU nose tackle Tyler Shelvin, East Carolina left tackle Deontay Smith, kicker Evan McPherson, Georgia center Trey Hill, Michigan running back Chris Evans, and Kansas State defensive end Wyatt Hubert. So, Ben, I'm going to come to you here. For Jamar Chase, obviously there was so much discussion. Is it going to be Jamar Chase or is it going to be Penei Sewell? We get the final answer here. It is going to be Jamar Chase down there or up there with the Bengals. What do you think of that selection and their overall thought process there? A lot of targets to replace in that offense with A.J. Green leaving Cincinnati as well.
Yeah, no more A.J. Green, no more John Ross, kind of cleaning the bottom of the roster there, but adding more weapons around their second-year quarterback, Joe Burrow. They already have T. Higgins. They have Tyler Boyd. They signed Joe Mixon to the long-term deal. I think they like the offbeat kind of style of Auden Tate and his red zone value. This is going to be a spread-them-out offense. The rest of the league is kind of going reduced, formations and a lot of running the ball and taking their shots off play action. Remember Joe Burrow with Joe Brady at LSU? A lot of empty sets, a lot of 5 wide stuff, spread out the defenses, let the quarterback pick you apart. Seems like Cincinnati is going for that style, and you're going to need weapons and threats on the outside in order to do that. So adding a Jamar Chase with Higgins and Boyd is a pretty dangerous trio.
And we talked about, the discussions that they were having certainly in that room when you pair, would you rather have the round 1 receiver with the round 2 tackle, or vice versa? We'd rather take Sewell and then see who we get at receiver in round 2. They end up with Jackson Carman there in round 2. So interesting, kind of seeing the way that they decided to go with that path. Dane, when you look at this class overall, who could shock us with the impact that they have in year 1 as a rookie?
I think, I don't know Joseph Osai, if he's going to be, how many starts he's going to have this year. He might not have any. But I think he's going to get on the field, especially in those passing situations, and he's going to be a nuisance rushing off the edge. And he's a guy that's still trying to figure out some of those subtle details about how to be a more efficient player. But from day one, what do we know about Osai? He's going to bring a nonstop motor, that first step explosion. It's really going to stress blockers. So he's not going to be a high volume pass rusher in terms of snaps. But it wouldn't surprise me if, maybe he racks up the production and is able to make an early impact that way.
Duke Tobin, who's the de facto general manager there for Cincinnati. He's been there for a long time. And the Bengals have had a lot of success finding pass rushers in the middle rounds, round 3, round 4, round 5. You look back at their history, they've done a really nice job of identifying those players. So I look at Osai, I look at Cam Sample, who they got in the 4th round out of Tulane. I think between those two players, they're going to hit on one of those two guys. And I really like Sample. He's got that versatile skill set. He's a little bit different from Osai, where Osai's got the versatility to be able to stand up and do some different things that way. Sample, kick him inside, and some of his best reps may come rushing over guards and centers. But I think between those two guys, they're going to hit on one of those two. I really like what they did there in the middle rounds with getting after the quarterback. Ben, let's come to you here. Day 3, who's got the highest ceiling of these day 3 selections?
Well, I think LSU nose tackle Tyler Shelvin, his potential is through the roof. This is a through and through boom or bust prospect. I think his ceiling is way up here. I think his floor is way down below as well. I don't really think there's a lot of middle ground. Could he be a Vince Wilfork, Casey Hampton type of nose tackle? He's flashed that at LSU. He's a guy that gave Landon Dickerson some trouble in 2019. This is a guy that's barely played 600 snaps in his college career. You haven't seen him very often on the field out there, being a big 340-pound nose tackle who's had all sorts of weight issues up and down. Going to be really nice pair with DJ Reader, who they spent big money on in free agency last year. Those are two massive nose tackles in the trenches there. I think they need a little bit more juice to replace that Geno Atkins presence. We'll see if Larry Ogunjobi is going to be that for him or not. But Tyler Shelvin on day 3 has a lot of potential.
To me, guys, looking big picture at this class as we go over the top, any overall thoughts? And to me, I look at this a lot of linemen, right? Offensive line, defensive line. That was clearly an area of focus after that team just got crushed by injuries and opt-outs going into the 2020 season on both sides of the football. Clearly, after the Jamar Chase pick, and that's why, we say this all the time, a draft isn't just about round 1. And there was a lot of thought, how could they do this to Joe Burrow? This guy's going to get crushed. Well, they still go and they get 2 offensive linemen in the draft, right? Or they got 3 offensive linemen in the draft. They still go and get pass rusher reinforcements as well, both inside and outside. So, they clearly placed an emphasis on trying to beef up the trenches. Ben, overall thoughts when you look at this class as a whole?
Yeah, it's exactly what I saw there. Just trying to address the trenches. They did it in free agency, bringing over Riley Reif and Quentin Spain, and then going hard in the draft with Trey Hill out of Georgia. Could very easily win the center job. Deontay Smith is one of our favorite developmental tackles out of ECU. So I think protecting Joe Burrow and keeping him upright is certainly the name of the game heading into year 2, year 3, and for the rest of his career.
Dane, what'd you see there?
I'm interested in how that first pick is really all about, I think, Zach Taylor. We talked about leading up to the draft, how, their decision to go receiver over offensive line and how that really comes down to this team's desire to be more of a downfield passing team. Zach Taylor, he's got 6 wins in 2 years as a head coach, and he has an offensive background that hasn't exactly translated on the field for Cincinnati. So, last week we talked about how the Kadarius Toney pick was all about Daniel Jones and the Jalen Waddle pick was all about Tua. But with this Jamar Chase pick, I think it's all about helping the head coach and doing what he wants to do on offense. I have no doubt that, Tobin and the front office, they were behind the Chase pick as well. But this pick was more about Taylor and what that says about the organization and how he still has plenty of support as being the head coach for now, at least. Joe Burrow, I think, is going to be successful no matter who's out there. The Jamar Chase pick, to me, was all about the head coach.
Well, let's stay in the state of Ohio here and transition to the Cleveland Browns. I'll run through their picks really quick. Day 1, they get the Northwestern corner, Greg Newsome. Day 2, they trade up for Notre Dame linebacker Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah, and they take the Auburn speedster wide receiver Anthony Schwartz. On day 3, Cincinnati offensive tackle James Hudson, Ohio State defensive tackle Tommy Togiai, West Virginia linebacker Tony Fields, Georgia safety Richard LeCount, and UCLA running back Demetric Felton. Let's look at the top pick here in Greg Newsome. Dane, overall thoughts on the pick of Greg Newsome and why you think he was the selection there for the Browns?
I do a lot of Browns media during the pre-draft process, and every time, I did a radio or a TV or whatever, we talked about, okay, what's the ideal pick for the Browns at 26? To me, I said the same name every single time, and it was Newsome. I think he can really be this year's Jedrick Wills for that team. The way Wills stabilized the offensive line for the Browns last year, Newsome can do that for the secondary. Not only does he have the talent, but he checks a lot of boxes that the Browns organization prioritizes. They want top athletic testers. They want young players in terms of age, players who have been productive versus top level competition. Newsome checks all those boxes. Plus, he fills a big need for this team. Denzel Ward, he'll be the starter on one side. They signed Troy Hill. He'll play probably mostly in the nickel. And then they're hoping Greedy Williams will be healthy, but you just don't know. That's far from a guarantee. That leaves Newsome to see considerable playing time, likely as a starter from day one.
And even if he's not, because Troy Hill, he could play on the outside if they're playing in base, but they want to be a sub-package defense. I mean, you look at what they've added to that safety room over the last 2 off seasons. They want to be a heavy nickel or a heavy dime team. You want to be a heavy nickel team. So, you can always use more outside corners. So even if Greedy Williams is healthy, adding Greg Newsome to the fold certainly is going to be big for that defense, for that secondary, the way they want to play. I think he'd certainly check a lot of boxes. Ben, when you look at this class overall, let's look at a competition edition here. Which of these players enters a crowded room to kind of compete in and may have some trouble making an early impact in the stat sheet?
Well, I like the additions they grabbed at the linebacking spot. Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah in round 2 is great value. I love Tony Fields II out of West Virginia, the former Arizona Wildcat, had a really good week down at the Senior Bowl. I think it's a perfect sub-package linebacker. But this is a deep linebacking room as it is. They have Sione Takitaki. They have Jacob Phillips and Mac Wilson, young linebackers. They just signed Anthony Walker from the Indianapolis Colts on a 1-year free agent contract. They also have the veteran Malcolm Smith. And they played a variety of these guys last year. Never really had that stability. But adding Fields and JOK, this is 6-7 deep at linebacker at the moment, to the point I don't think they could keep all these guys. And they spent big money on John Johnson, safety coming from the Los Angeles Rams, who's very much a downhill kind of run-plugging safety. A lot of bodies there in the box at linebacker and kind of box safety.
Yeah, Ronnie Harrison there. I mean, it's going to be interesting to see how they use
Richard
all
LeCount in the 5th round, another guy that wants to scream downhill and contribute in the run game. A lot of intriguing athletic bodies there. I just don't think there's room for everybody. So let the cream rise to the top.
Yeah, that's why that sub-package defense is going to be really interesting to watch. Dane, when you look at this class, let's connect the dots here. Is there a guy that you could have predicted? I mean, just by following the breadcrumbs, you talked about Greg Newsome and how he just checked so many boxes. Was there anybody, when you look at the rest of this class, that really kind of fit that for you?
Yeah, Newsome was definitely probably the easiest, but I think you also look at Anthony Schwartz in the 3rd round. A lot of those boxes that we talked about with Newsome, you could say the same with Schwartz. Still only 20 years old, an elite speed player. He's already one of the fastest players in the NFL, and he faced SEC competition. The production was a little mixed, but he still led Auburn in catches in 2020. So I think that was another one of those picks in a loaded wide receiver class that the Browns are going to be interested in a player like Schwartz, who, you don't need a player that's going to step in from day one and be a starter, but long-term, it might be something there. He has yet to play his best football. And so I think that's the breadcrumbs were definitely there with the Auburn receiver.
And that's the thing, is that despite the fact that this is just this regime's 2nd draft, you really kind of see the template, and you hit on it, Dane. I mean, they want young kids, brand name schools, production, high athletic testers, a lot of these guys check so many of these boxes. And now that's why I was a little bit surprised by the trade up for Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah, just considering that both of those things, whether it was a trade up or especially for a linebacker, I don't think either of those are necessarily analytically friendly, but I think everything else you look at and you're like, yeah, like this makes a lot of sense. And Owusu-Koramoah certainly does check a lot of those boxes. So I think when you look at the way that they build their team and the way that they built this class, it fits. Even like if you look at the only non-Power 5 player they drafted, in James Hudson, who I do like there, get to work with Bill Callahan as one of the best offensive line developers. This is a guy who hasn't played a ton on the offensive line. Yeah, he came from Cincinnati, which is a Group of 5 school, but remember, he started his career at Michigan. So, this is all of these guys were brand name, high pedigree type of players. Ben, when you look at the rest of this class, is there anything else that stands out to you over the top?
No, I think finding some defensive stability, some more just, down to down presence, rather than just having all these young bodies in and out, which I think really hurt them last year. Their front is really interesting. I mean, how many teams have two former number one overall picks? Myles Garrett, Jadeveon Clowney. They signed Malik Jackson free agency. We all love Tommy Togiai. How about adding Malik McDowell and then Marvin Wilson as an undrafted free agent? Two guys that you could shake up the 8 ball and say, can they play? No chance. Shake it again and say Hall of Famers. It's those type of guys with really exciting kind of traits, boom or bust players. I think competition, particularly on the defensive side of the ball. There's a lot of deep position groups, but they need it. Not all these guys are going to stick and make this roster, but they need to compete and get stronger and more defensive stability.
Dane, anything else big picture takeaway was for the Browns?
Going back to the Schwartz pick, there's no question they're going to manufacture touches for him this year, but they wanted to target a receiver that's really going to help make an impact for them in 2022. There's a very high chance that either Jarvis Landry or Odell Beckham or both will not be on this team after the 2021 season, and they need someone to step in and compete for a starting role in 2022. So they think Schwartz can be that guy. And so I think tracking his development this season will be important to watch to give us a better idea how much of a need wide receiver could be for this team next offseason.
And Ben, we studied that Cleveland Browns team last year. We know the structure of offense that they want to try and play, run game, play action. When you've got Anthony Schwartz there and what he can be from a speed standpoint, think of all the vertical stretch, the horizontal stretch, what that does, not just for Anthony Schwartz. I think that's why, to me, his impact is more felt for everybody else on offense. In theory, if he's able to get on the field, what that can do for the Jarvis Landrys of the world, and for everybody else working the middle of the field, that really can help everybody else. That to me is what stands out most about that pick. Let's go here to the Pittsburgh Steelers, guys. I'll run through their picks really fast. Najee Harris, the first running back off the board, going to the Pittsburgh Steelers in round 1. Day 2, you get tight end Pat Freiermuth from Penn State, Illinois center Kendrick Green. Day 3, Texas A&M left tackle Dan Moore, Texas A&M linebacker Buddy Johnson, Wisconsin defensive lineman Isaiah Loudermilk, pass rusher Quincy Roche from Miami, Oklahoma safety Trey Norwood, and then Georgia Tech punter Presley Harvin III. Ben, let's bring it back to Najee Harris. Why do you feel like he was the selection? Obviously, a really interesting pick there. One that I think like a lot of people had pegged Harris to go into the Steelers. The first offensive player selected in the first round by Kevin Colbert. That's a little bit of a fun fact there. And Colbert's been the GM there for a long time, about a decade. So the first offensive player selected in round 1 by the Steelers in quite some time. Overall thoughts there on Najee Harris ending up in Pittsburgh?
Well, there's certainly a need for that bell cow running back. They let James Conner go in free agency and never really solidified that position once Le'Veon Bell left. But you got to protect your veteran quarterback and Big Ben. They're going to run the ball. That AFC North mentality, that style, the tone, they're going to run it, be a physical team, late in November, December, and they have high expectations to be a team playing in January. You got to be able to run the football and set the tone through the trenches and through that running back spot. And he really does remind me of that kind of upright slashing presence of Le'Veon, who everybody forgets was 230 pounds coming out of Michigan State. He was a big boy that had really good upside in the pass game. Najee Harris checks a lot of those boxes, very similar.
When you look at the rest of this draft class here, Dane, when you look at the best fit, who's a player that can come in and have that early path to success because of the situation he walks into, is there a name that stands out above the rest for you there?
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's a few with Pat Freiermuth and the way he can step in. Eric Ebron's going to be your pass catching tight end, but Freiermuth's especially when we see them go, 12 personnel and, get 2 tight ends on the field. Freiermuth's going to be a guy that they ask to do some of the dirty work, but he should get some targets to really dependable players. So I think, we're going to see him get on the field early. And then with Kendrick Green, whether it's center or guard, he's going to help that offensive line. And just to echo what Ben said with Najee, I think he hit the nail on the head. It's fair to envision that we're going to see the Steelers really try to recreate the offense that we saw 3-4 years ago with Le'Veon Bell. Harris is going to get a ton of carries, but also, he's going to motion outside. He's going to run routes. I mean, they're trying to recreate the Bell days with this short-term window that they have with Roethlisberger. And not only that, but then, the eventual transition to whoever takes over for him at quarterback. So, it's just an interesting, way to attack this that it might work out, it might not, but it would be interesting to watch.
And to me, that's what one of my over-the-top takeaways from this team was just the concerted effort towards fixing the run game, getting that going. And obviously they stayed true to their template, heavy on big schools, guys from that area of the country continue to be a focus, it seems, which is interesting. But when you look at Najee Harris, obviously Kendrick Green was maybe my favorite pick for the Steelers in that draft overall. Pat Freiermuth can help at the point of attack as well. I think certainly a concerted effort towards fixing the run game, making the offense a little bit more quarterback friendly. I think that is certainly something to take away. Ben, when you look at this class overall, just big picture thoughts on the Pittsburgh Steelers?
No, I think you just like Dane said, you're trying to replace that Le'Veon Bell presence. You're trying to replace that Heath Miller presence and Pat Freiermuth. You're trying to replace the Pouncey presence in Kendrick Green. You're trying to hit reload on some very pillar players from your heyday, that you're a very successful competitive team just a short 5 years ago. But all those guys are gone. There's new blood in there aside from the quarterback spot. So we'll see if they have the ability to kind of replicate that prowess.
Dane, anything to close out the Steelers?
You mentioned how first offensive player in the first round in quite some time, and this is a team that gave up 48 points to the Browns in that playoff game. So interesting that they didn't address defense until the end of the fourth round. They went offense first 4 picks. And, you could say that they were all about those offensive picks are all about the short-term window with Ben Roethlisberger. And it's an interesting strategy. But Roethlisberger's 39 years old, and we just don't know, what he's going to look like this upcoming year, especially after he takes a few hits. So certainly risk involved, but it's an interesting strategy that we'll have to see how it plays out.
All right, well, let's close up our discussion, guys, with the final AFC North team. That's the Baltimore Ravens. We'll run through their picks real fast. 2 day 1 selections: wide receiver Rashad Bateman from Minnesota, pass rusher Odafe Oweh from Penn State. Day 2 picks here: guard Ben Cleveland from Georgia, Brandon Stevens, the former corner at SMU, who looks like it sounds, just reading the press clippings after the draft, that they view him as more of a free safety moving forward into Baltimore. And then a couple of day 3 selections here: Tylan Wallace, the Oklahoma State wide receiver, Ohio State cornerback Shaun Wade, Notre Dame pass rusher Dalen Hayes, and then Michigan fullback Ben Mason. Let's talk about their first pick. And to me, Dane, I'll come to you here. Whether you want to go Bateman or you want to go Oweh, what are your thoughts overall on why they went either of those 2 directions?
Bateman gives them just a different type of receiver that they have. He's a player that should really help the development of Lamar Jackson, especially outside the numbers where he has struggled to be a consistent passer. Bateman is so detail focused as a receiver, timing, separation. He's just going to be a lot more precise with his routes compared to the receivers currently on that Ravens depth chart. So when the quarterback expects him to be in a specific spot and he's there, that's going to give Jackson more confidence that he can rip off that throw. And it's always interesting when you have a team with 2 picks that are very close together like this with the Ravens. Obviously, they were a little more worried about losing Bateman than they were with Oweh, right. and both really good players. But the fact that they took Bateman first is certainly noteworthy, that that's the guy that they really wanted to add to that offense to help the development of the quarterback, even though pass rusher still a big need as well with Oweh. So just interesting the order that they took those 2 guys.
And isn't it funny too that obviously we know that that Odafe Oweh, one of those players that, was the biggest high risk player in the draft, I guess, when you look at his overall skill set. But when a player like that ends up in Baltimore that has the history that they do of developing edge talent, you're like, oh, all right, Oweh's going to hit. It's like one of those things. As soon as you see that name go across the screen, you're like, all right, well, I feel better about that transition now than if he had ended up in another town. But it's kind of interesting to see how that works. I agree with you, man. Bateman, unlike any other receiver they have on the roster, just brings a different kind of skill set in terms of his just really versatile way that he's able to win. He can win in a lot of different ways. Ben, let's come to you here for the day 3 impact. 4 players there on the 3rd day. Which of these guys makes the biggest impact? What do you say long-term impact of those 4 picks?
I so badly just want to know, is Greg Roman going to pull out the 2 fullback formation this season with
He
Patrick
is.
Ricard and Ben Mason? I
Has to.
don't know if Mason's going to get enough play time with Ricard out there. So I'm going to go with Dalen Hayes, actually out of Notre Dame, who I think is much more ready to play than a Jason Oweh, who has all the traits and is, obviously has the upside. But Dalen Hayes is really tough against the run. He's a decent pass rusher. He can slide in and do some work at 3 tech as well. And ahead of him on the depth chart at that kind of Sam rush end is Tyus Bowser and Jalen Ferguson. I think it's very, feasible for him to kind of win that job and win snaps. And my other prediction, I think Tylan Wallace will be a fixture of this offense before the season's end. I think he's going to leapfrog Duvernay, Proche, Miles Boykin. Hollywood Brown may still be the shot play guy and may have more production. I see Sammy Watkins is out there as well. I think when it's all said and done, maybe 12, 18 months from now, it's Rashad Bateman and Tylan Wallace, 1 and 1A on the outside.
And doesn't Wallace perfectly fit? How many devastating crack blocks did we see from Wallace over the course of his career at Oklahoma State? He's going to fit the identity of that offense.
No question. I think Boykin's still going to be a matchup red zone guy. Marquise Hollywood Brown, still the gadgety shot play guy. But the fixture of the offense, give me Bateman, give me Tylan Wallace.
And even when you look at the big picture, you have Duvernay as can be a little bit of a gadget, get him the ball in space, just the yards after catch. You're running back at playing receiver. Obviously Marquise Brown with his speed. I mean, they've got a very versatile skill set at the receiver position. It's about just making it all mesh, making it all work together. It's going to be interesting to find.
Well, with that 2 fullback package, everything clicks.
Everything works. Yeah, exactly right. Dane, when you look at the best value, which pick through this draft was the best value in your mind when you look at the Ravens?
I think Tylan Wallace has to be the answer, right? Yeah. I mean, and you have to think that the knee was a little bit of a factor there,
right?
Towards ACL, towards the end of the 2019 season, didn't always look quite the same this past season, 2020, but still a guy that made plays and did enough over his career that, you thought, okay, this guy's a second, third round talent at the worst. Right. So to get him in the 4th, part of that's the product of a really deep wide receiver class, but then also a little bit with the knee. Nonetheless, I mean, I agree with everything that you guys said about Wallace. And then you throw Shaun Wade in there as well. I think that's
a good situation for him.
Right, exactly. And to get him the 5th, I think that's the appropriate time to take a swing on a guy like Shaun Wade, who is clearly talented. It's just, you have to figure out what happened this past year. And is it as simple as just moving him back inside? Or, what else do you have to do? You have to pop the hood, reconfigure some things and just get him figured out. So, but at that point in the 5th round, the value is worth the selection at that point.
And Ben, we've seen that team. You talk about Shaun Wade. We've seen the Baltimore Ravens work with bigger slot corners in the past. Marlon Humphrey's their full-time nickel. And, could he be Jimmy Smith at this stage of his career? Jimmy Smith now, not Jimmy Smith of 5, 6, 7 years ago, where he's a big nickel or even a deep safety, and his ability to come downhill. I kind of wonder if he can fill that kind of role.
Well, that's one of my over-the-top points there is just their type at defensive back.
There you go.
Can you run? We don't care. Can you cover? I don't know if we really care. Can you run through this brick wall for us first?
Right.
That's our kind of litmus test. And when you look at, Shaun Wade, Brandon Stevens, the former running back projecting a safety, Darius Washington is one of the tougher pound-for-pound kids.
Yeah.
And then just their existing defensive back room. Some very, very tough guys back there. Obviously some speed and some coverage skills as well with Marcus Peters and Marlon Humphrey and some guys like that. But Tavon Young and Deshaun Elliott, Chucky Clark, they have a tight back there.
Yeah, I mean, we hear the axiom all the time, right? The Ozzie Newsome, all the people that come from that tree, speed, toughness, instincts across the board, but especially in the back 7. I think that shows up with the kinds of players they bring in. Dane, any other over-the-top thoughts on the Ravens here?
I think it was just surprising they didn't draft a defensive lineman. They took Oweh and they took Dalen Hayes, pass rushers, but this is a team that loves to load up on the defensive line on the interior, and not that they necessarily need one. I'm just surprised they didn't, because that's what they love to do. Whether it's Matabuke or, Worley, they just have a history of drafting those big boys up front to really pad their defensive line. So a little bit of a surprise they didn't look to do that this year in this year's class.
And I do think
pressure on the ageless wonder Calais Campbell coming over in free agency,
which you have a feeling he's still got plenty of gas left in that tank.
I'm not the one to doubt him or rule him out. So the other thing, Fran, Ben Cleveland, was that not the most Baltimore Ravens pick of the draft? You could have easily slotted that. I didn't know what round 3 was a little bit rich. But let me tell you, if you guys get your hands on his kind of shirtless workout at the Senior Bowl, he is the best looking 350 pounds I've seen in years. And put him side by side with Deontay Brown, who I think was similar height, weight, completely different body types. Yep. I think it's fascinating to see the same height, weight in completely different packages. Ben Cleveland looks like he was chiseled out of stone.
He looks like Paul Bunyan.
Yes.
I mean, that's what he is. Yeah.
Yeah, it changes your life when you see him working out shirtless. When you see Ben Cleveland doing his work. To me, it's always interesting when you see that regime change at the top. When you look at general managers and moving on from a legend like Ozzie Newsome, who's still there in the building, to Eric DeCosta, who's a lifelong Raven. How much would the thought process change? I do think it's interesting. They've definitely trended a little bit younger. In the past, they were not afraid to take guys who were 24, even 25, 26 years old. Right? I mean, you saw that. When they took the kid Hayden Hurst, the tight end from South Carolina, a couple of years ago. But since DeCosta has taken over, highly athletic, a lot of speed, and then younger guys, and from bigger schools too. This is another team that really prioritizes getting players from big schools. And you mentioned the size. I mean, they just are a big team, physical team across the board. They still fit that profile. Well, guys, we covered 7 teams here today in this segment of Draft Buzz. We're going to cover one more now with Chris Burke from The Athletic. Let's get now to the blueprint.
Raise a glass to that comforting feeling of an Eagles touchdown with the all-new Broad & Pattison wine collection created in partnership with Wink, featuring a Cabernet, a Rosé, and a Chardonnay. Broad & Pattison wines are the perfect pairing for any occasion. Now you can bring this sweet taste of victory with you to a dinner with friends or to the tailgate with your game day crew. Purchase online today at philadelphiaeagles.com/wine to stock up and have Broad & Pattison delivered right to your door. A portion of proceeds from every bottle benefit Eagles Autism Foundation.
All 32 teams are always under construction. How are they being built? Let's check out the blueprint.
Well, excited to welcome in for the first time here on the Journey to the Draft podcast, the guy who covers this Detroit Lions team very, very closely and also always has his eye on the NFL draft. That's Chris Burke from The Athletic. Chris, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. Happy to get the invite. I've been waiting for the debut performance here.
I say that it is his first time. I feel like you definitely have been on a couple of years back, but definitely the first time lately. And obviously today, a lot of our focus is going to be squarely on this Detroit Lions team. And obviously a lot of talk about them coming into this draft, new coaching staff, new front office led by Brad Holmes coming over from the LA Rams. And I guess that's how we can start this is, coming into this draft, were there any pre-existing trends when you go and you look back on his days with the Rams, working with Les Snead, that you guys as a media were kind of, keeping an eye on and expecting coming into this draft? Was there anything that kind of comes off the top?
Yeah, that was definitely one of the tricky things because they not only brought him over, Ray Agnew came and then John Dorsey came. So you're kind of looking back through John Dorsey's stuff too and saying, well, what did he like to do? What sort of things made sense for him? But I think the biggest one that jumped out, kind of going through the process was just how much the Rams under Holmes and Snead really trusted their sort of mid-round evaluations of guys. I think every organization would say that they do, but the Rams really leaned into it, to the point where they didn't really like picking in the first round. It seemed like all that much. They were willing to give away those picks because they were so confident they could do well in days 2 and 3. And I think, we kind of saw that. I thought they might trade back and try to collect some picks for that very reason, but they really did target some guys. Holmes talked. He said they considered trading up a few times. We kind of heard the rumors early in that top 10 that they might try to go up or go back, but they also tried to move up a couple of times later on and sort of just really target some guys that they wanted there. And I think they did a nice job. They got some players, late day 2, early day 3 that are they're going to have to play some roles for them because that roster doesn't have a whole lot coming back.
Yeah, I mean, clearly you look at what Les Snead has done with the LA Rams. They look at those first round picks as equity to be able to go and get proven veterans, guys that they wouldn't necessarily have the chance to get if you're picking in the first round of the draft. The Jalen Ramseys of the world, that goes on and on down the list. But interesting to see that, the Lions. I mean, there was that video that came out from the Falcons. They had made that try to make the call to try and get up to number 4. So they looked to try and be aggressive as well. Were there any other trends that you guys kind of had your eye on going into this draft?
This one that it's kind of tough for us to track because we don't have all the numbers that they do. Maybe you have more than I have access to, but Dan Campbell mentioned it after they picked Jamar Jefferson in the 7th round, as a running back. That's one of the positions that the Rams have gone after on day 3. Like safety, running back were kind of the two we had circled. They didn't take a safety, but they are big on quote unquote play speed. They're big into tracking sort of the GPS numbers of what a guy's doing when he's on the field and how quickly they're running with the ball in their hands. So Jamar Jefferson wasn't a guy who ran all that fast 40 time, but Dan Campbell said he was one of the fastest running backs from that play speed, sort of next gen GPS perspective. And that was something that, again, that they have. That's sort of one of the bread and butter things that Holmes went after with the Rams. He sort of built a lot of his scouting around, how quickly does this guy play, not necessarily how fast does he test. So that was one. Again, it was hard. We don't have the GPS numbers for all these guys, so it was hard to sort of go back and do that. But I think a few of these guys that they took probably wound up scoring pretty high in that regard.
Yeah, I think we've talked about that on the show before, how that's kind of the missing link. While the NFL teams are certainly valuing these GPS numbers, the NFL is all about fan interest and media interest. And until the fans and the media have access to those numbers, right. I do wonder, about just how widespread those numbers could be in the future. Was there a third trade or anything that had kind of stood out to you guys going into this class?
The big one that they kept talking about the whole time was finding guys with grit and finding guys with toughness. And again, that's kind of hard to it's kind of hard to quantify as you're going up to the draft. But I think you start looking for certainly guys that kind of pop on tape for having that sort of play through the whistle mentality. But also, I think it was one of the things that you were trying to balance. Like Penei Sewell obviously had a bunch of starts. He played some high level opponents, but then he was off for a year. So, how much are they weighing the experience factor there? How much are they weighing him deciding to sit out a year? How does that all fall under their grit umbrella? So, I think, again, especially a guy like, look at Lee McNeil, look at Derek Barnes, like those are guys who are going to get in there and mix it up for you. And Barnes, especially, I know they love kind of the mentality that he brings. So I think that defensively, above all, they were looking for some of those, kind of hard-nosed throwback guys, which probably isn't surprising given the type of coaching staff they put together.
We will see if we can make it through this entire hit without talking about, a certain part of the body, a kneecap or so. But I think when you look through this class, and it kind of speaks to it, and I'll kind of list out these picks. Penei Sewell in round 1. Day 2, you get Levi Onwuzurike, the defensive tackle from Washington. Aleem McNeil, as you referenced, from NC State, a defensive tackle. Another player in round 3, Ifeatu Melifonwu, the corner from Syracuse. And then on day 3, just 3 selections, Amon-Ra St. Brown from USC, Derek Brown's the linebacker from Purdue, and then Jamar Jefferson, the running back from Oregon State. You talked about the toughness aspect. I mean, Penei Sewell brings that, in terms of on the field. Penei Sewell brings that. Onwuzurike brings that. Melifonwu, I thought, showed some toughness coming downhill. Amon-Ra St. Brown will block guys out of bounds and through the back of the end zone. You talk about Derek Barnes as well. Jefferson, a physical back. So it does feel like that toughness factor, that competitive factor, definitely came through. Were there any other of these other trends that really kind of that stood out to you that you talked about coming in? Did some of that mesh up, or did they kind of go off the script a little bit?
Well, I think the one that, again, sort of the play speed aspect of it, but I think just in general, they had to get faster and more athletic on both sides of the ball, but especially on defense. I mean, that defense was like, if you talk to people around the league that played them last year, that was one of the slowest defenses, like in how it actually performed, that any team really put out there on the field in 2020. And so I think that was something that, they were trying to sort of mingle those things we were talking about, the GPS and the play speed, with guys who actually had some legitimate speed and some could test well in the 3-cone and things like that. So I think they were trying to bridge that gap a little. They just had to get more athletic across the board. And I think that looking at we'd had Onwuzurike circled as a possibility for them. We'd had McNeil circled as a possibility for them because they checked off those boxes of being versatile guys up front, being experienced guys, having some meanness to them, but also guys who maybe had more athletic upside than what you saw in college, which is another thing. It's kind of tough to figure out as we're watching through. But Aleem McNeil playing pretty much exclusively nose tackle at NC State, over the ball. And I think they're going to give him a few more chances to move around and penetrate and just take advantage of some of the things he can do there. So, I think that there's some Rams imprints here, but it was also interesting to hear Brad Holmes talk about, there were moments in the draft room when other guys were sort of telling him to just be patient and sit back and wait for people to come to them because he wanted to get super aggressive a couple times. And, that's him, I think, trying to figure out exactly which way he's going to go with this as it goes forward.
Yeah, and I think they were kind of a really interesting team coming in because they were sitting at an interesting spot at 7 overall, and just kind of looking at the first round only. There was talk about, could it be receiver? Could they potentially go corner? Could they go quarterback? Could they go Kyle Pitts if he fell down to them? Like,
right,
And obviously we talked earlier about the potential for moving up as well. To me, like when the dust settles, they end up with Penei Sewell. At the end of the day, what do you think led them to that selection? What were the things that most drew them towards the stud tackle from Oregon?
Yeah, I mean, I think that first and foremost, it's just sort of the identity that they want to be building here. There were 3 guys at that spot that I think if they were going to stay put that they were looking at, and it was Sewell, Rashawn Slater, I think, and then Jamar Chase was the other one that it sounded like they really liked. And, I think the trades up were for Sewell, but I can't say that with 100% certainty. There were also some reports that they really wanted to go up and get Chase. So, but in terms of Sewell, like this is going to be a team that they really want to be built from the trenches out. And especially this first year, as they're sort of trying to lay the foundation here, they're going to have to control that line of scrimmage as much as possible. They want to be able to run the ball and use play action a ton and sort of move the pocket. And they've got some guys in Swift, DeAndre Swift, Jamal Williams, who can run those zone plays, are really good. And so you need obviously some linemen that can move to do that. And so I think all the types of X's and O's things they want to do are there. But then you're also talking about a guy in Penei Sewell. We mentioned the toughness. I mean, he's a smart guy. He understands sort of every spot on that line. He's only 20 years old. So it was who's going to help us now? But also, I think we're looking at that pick and saying, well, all right, now we put him in at right tackle. Taylor Decker's at the left. 3-4 years from now, we move Sewell to the left, and he's 24, and maybe he's been already an All-Pro. So I think that it sort of all fits with what they're trying to build.
And I'm glad that you brought that up in terms of him going over to right tackle as a rookie. There was some questioning. There's some concern, I guess, from draft Twitter, from the multiverse here, in terms of what is the fit early on. And that was going to be my last question for you, Chris, was, when you look at how they approach this draft from a needs versus best player available scenario, how do you feel that they addressed that looking at this class?
I think they did pretty well. I mean, I do think that they trended a little more towards best player available, which is really the way you should be going as much as possible. I think, if they're going into next year or the year after needing a quarterback, that sort of changes the dynamic of the board. But I think this year they just needed to get whoever was at the top of their board when they went on the clock is who they needed to pick, because they're so talent starved compared to the rest of the league. But again, we've been talking about, I think they landed, you look through this and just where their roster's at, they've got 5 guys, probably maybe 6 that are going to end up starting pretty early on here. Certainly Sewell, and then those guys they took throughout the rest of day 2, day 3. I mean, Amon-Ra St. Brown could be like a 70 catch guy for them, the way this receiver core is set up. So I think they did well to start filling some needs, but they also, it was made a little easier in that regard because they needed everything, other than maybe a starting tight end or a starting running back. You could have picked just about anything and made a case for it. So I think you always come out probably looking a little better when that's how you're approaching the draft.
Well, it's an interesting starting point here for Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell, that whole regime. A lot of talented players ended up in Detroit. It'll be interesting to talk about this team over the next couple of years as they kind of build on that. Chris, thanks so much for joining us here on the Journey to the Draft podcast presented by Life Brand. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll hope to see you soon, man.
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks for having me.
Now it's time to hear from you, the fans, in the Draft Mailbag.
Well, good stuff there from Chris Burke, who, like I said, does a great job covering the Detroit Lions for The Athletic. Now let's get to our one question here. And it's not really a question. It's more of a comment that left on our Apple Podcast page. And that is the number one way to support this show is to go on Apple Podcast or Stitcher, leave us a rating and leave us a comment. Shout out here to Ernie Purcell, who left a 5-star review saying, I tuned in over the last few weeks to quench my draft thirst, and I loved it. Hearing Kenny Gainwell discussed on the podcast a few days before the draft even started was awesome to see play out. No Fran said that he'll cut up previous clips of other players they talked about pre-draft. That also sounds great. With 3 potential first rounders next year, the journey of the draft is going to stick in my rotation. That's obviously an Eagles fan there in Ernie Purcell. So Ernie, thank you so much for listening. And yes, that is the goal, right? That's the plan, is that you can be ready for next year's draft. If you're an Eagles fan, the Eagles potentially have 3 first-round picks a year from now. Be ready for those conversations that you're going to have in February, March, and April just by listening to this draft or by listening to this podcast. We're going to cover all of the top prospects, all the prospects you're going to know about day 2, day 3, all throughout. And we're going to talk about it on a weekly basis right here on the show. No matter what team you root for, we're going to have you covered. And especially if you're an Eagles fan, gearing up for what should be a very fruitful 2022 NFL draft class. Great stuff here from Dane Brugler, Ben Fennell, obviously Chris Burke as well. Thank you to Ernie for his comment over on our Apple Podcast page. We'll be back later this week. Our Journey series, Devontae Smith dropping later this week right here on the Journey to the Draft podcast presented by Life Brand. Download the official mobile app of the Philadelphia Eagles. Catch breaking news, see real-time stats, watch live or on-demand video clips, listen to Eagles podcasts, and so much more. Now you can stay in touch with the Eagles anytime, anywhere.